thanks everyone for showing up here today. Scott has just given an awesome presentation, but I'm pretty sure that every presentation only causes more questions. Maybe start off with a question to give you a little bit of time to come up with a really great question. There's always something that you have to cut out of your presentation. So there's only so much time on stage. Is there anything that you said, okay, I would have liked to have also been able to say that?
Yeah, I mean, actually, I did sort of a presentation at the Google event a couple days ago, and we talked a lot more about the future of open source, which I find very interesting, of trying to figure out with large language models, with AI, like if AI is kind of writing a lot of code for us, what does that mean for open source, right? Is there a place for open source, or does it change, or does it, like, what does open source look like in the near future? And one of the things I'm excited about the idea of is being able to use sort of these language models that produce code and take it and implement it and verify it and say, this is, like if I say, write me Rust code that solves this, this problem in Git or whatever, that it does it, and maybe it's not quite right and I have to fix it or something, and I can hit a button and say, contribute this solution back to sort of an open source snippet database or solutions or recipes database or something, and I can verify as a user, this is a verified solution. This does work. For this particular problem set, this works for me, right? It's not just something that the LLM came up with out of thin air, that it can retrain and sort of make all of these solutions better for all of these individual solutions to problems in languages, right? And I think that that's where open source is going to go, because right now it's really at the project level or the library level at GitHub. GitHub's not very good at saying, find me a function that does this in this language. It's relatively hard to find that type of solution. But I think that's where open source will go, is a combination of these things, right? You can find a project or a library on GitHub, or maybe there's another, maybe GitHub does this, maybe we do this, maybe somebody else does this, but say, I want this I want this solution in Rust, and then I can verify it, and then maybe you can even build up status by verifying. That can be kind of your role as an open source contributor, is not just writing code, but verifying generated code and saying this does work, right? In a production context. Like that's another thing that we kind of miss out on in the open source world, is if I'm writing production code, it's very hard to kind of extract that and share that with people in an easy way. There's a lot of overhead involved, and I think if there's a solution where you can hit a button and say, okay, you can share this with the world, and it's very low overhead, then I think that we'll get a lot more smaller sort of open source sort of contributions in a way that will help everybody, will be really valuable for everybody. So that's where I think open source, 2.0 or 3.0 or however you want to think about it, that's where I think the next stage of open source is, and I'm very passionate about open source, right? Like it's what I've been doing for a long time. So I'm excited about that future of open source.
Hey, I love open source. The first time I opened a Linux server, I realized this was, okay, this is open source, and the first thing it says, there's no guarantee whatsoever. and yet the whole world depends on it. And so somehow we trust open source sometimes more than, let's say, the closed source. So yeah. So can AI help us to find all these sort of open source code snippets?
Say that again?
Can AI help us find these code snippets? Because
yeah.
There's an ocean of open source, right? And how do you find the right pieces?
Yeah, I mean, I think AI is already relatively good at guessing what the solution would be based on open source training, right? Like I think the Codex, the OpenAI sort of LLM model that will produce code for you, or the ones that are being written now, are all trained on GitHub data, right? But again, like I think that on open source data, which is great that sort of data set exists, but again, there's a lot of code that it can't train on. All of this sort of private code that is the majority, really, probably, of the code on GitHub or that exists in the world is still closed, right? It's still stuff that you write internally and can't really share with the world. But you could share large snippets of it, right? In a way that's like, here's a generic solution to this function. How do I share that? And so I think it's more going to be about how can I extract smaller pieces and share those and have those open source in a way that is findable and usable easily in the tooling that we will start using more, which is language models, right? Which is ChatGPT or Copilot or whatever the next sort of phase of this is.
All right. So you've had enough time to think now. Who wants to do the first question? Oh, you were actually first.
Fine, thank you. So a lot of what you said in the presentation was similar to things that I've experienced. So I'm as lazy as it gets. And one of the best things, one of the greatest powers of open source is forking. And that's also one of the most dangerous ones. Because, for example, I've had pull requests made on open source projects that were closed 4 years after with a big thank you, but it was 4 years after. So how do you see the next version? So GitButler, what will the next version of Git be able to contribute with this problem? The power of being able to fork anything and use it right now, and the fragmentation that that brings.
I mean, that is, I hate saying that's a great question because that seems kind of dumb, but that is a great question. I mean, there's two different problems. So what I'm concentrating on and what I find really interesting right now is the Git client, right? Is how to work with your code and contribute and to contribute. But what you're asking is more about maintenance, right? Like forking and integrating, and that is always very difficult, especially in open source where you don't know necessarily the other person, right? Or you don't communicate as much with the team. Where you just see a problem and you solve it, but maybe that's not the problem or not the solution that the maintainer wants, and so now you have to fork, right, because you want that solution and somebody else wants this other solution or doesn't want that solution at all. I got this with the Pro Git book because it was open source, and somebody went through and like changed the entire book to, you know, active or, you know, passive voice or something, and I was like, that's fantastic, but like I don't want my book to read like that. Like I want it to be in my voice. Like I like the way that I wrote it, and so they get frustrated, right? If they do all this work and then you don't. So, but it's because there's no communication beforehand of somebody saying like, can I do this? So there is a collaboration aspect that I think it's hard for tools to solve really, no matter how advanced they get, because it's really about what are you trying to use this for, and if that diverges from what somebody else is trying to, or the more common thing is that you know, I open source something and then I don't want to deal with it anymore because I don't have that problem anymore, and then you have to find somebody to maintain it, and if there's nobody that cares enough, then it just kind of sits there, and then somebody's like, well, I want to contribute this fix, but there's nobody that cares about the project, right? And GitHub I think has gotten better at being able to transfer ownership, to be like, if you care, then take it, right? Like most of the open source projects that I've done that have become somewhat popular, I don't maintain any of them anymore because I don't have the time, and I'm not in that space anymore. I just don't care about those things specifically. And so most of them that have been popular have been taken over by somebody else that do use them. But like I really don't know how to solve that problem because you can't have an AI or whatever maintain a project probably. Like I mean, it's hard for it to have reasoning and taste about how it wants that to go. I mean, there could be something where there's, you know, sort of unified forks where it's like can figure out what merges well together, and you can kind of choose a flavor, right, out of a project or something like that. I'd be curious. I don't know is really the answer, but I'm fascinated. We can probably make some aspects of that certainly much easier, or GitHub could make aspects of that easier. But you know, more what I'm looking at is more of this smaller snippet recipe based thing, right? Of not necessarily how does a library fork and maintain multiple forks or transfer ownership, but how do we all collaborate more in our normal jobs, right? Yeah.
I was thinking that maybe AI will help us navigate the fork tree.
Yeah.
So if I'm trying to implement something, it would look in other forks and say, well, here's something that's related, and you don't have to do it maybe.
Yeah, I mean, there's also probably some automated maintenance that could be much easier, right? Where it's like you can maintain it, like tools for maintenance, where it can be like, here's, you know, data in all these forks. Maybe they didn't even open pull requests. Somebody just forked it and made some change or something, and then you're like, I want to, you know, you open a issue that's like, I want to fix this thing, and it's like, oh, I found one, right, somewhere else, or I found one in a similar project that probably fixes the same thing and can kind of, you know, open a pull request automatically, and or even say this is mergeable or this is tested, right? Like it can kind of pre-do all of those for you and really make the maintainer's job easier. Because I think you're right, like a lot of it is about code review, right? Like you have, in order to maintain a project, you have to review code all the time, and it's very expensive and it's very difficult. You have to get your mindset back in that space. So you're right, actually, it's a good point. There is probably a space for just automated maintenance of here are some things you probably, I've pre-reviewed them, right? Like AI has kind of pre-code reviewed them and make sure it merges and make sure it tests and make sure it solves the problem, writes a test that you know, exercises it, solves the problem, and then it's like, here's what I think, hit the button to merge it, right? And I can help you maintain that as opposed to you having to do all those steps yourself. I think that would be totally doable. Well, my co-founder actually at GitButler had a solution called CodeBall that kind of did automated AI code review on pull requests that probably is somewhere down the road to that, right? Or, I mean, you know, you can even think of a future where somebody opens an issue and the AI tries to figure out a solution and open a pull request for it and does all of that, right? Where you don't necessarily need to have somebody writing code for everything all the time, that there's something that writes pre-tested, pre-reviewed, pre-CI'd sort of code solutions that it thinks fixes the problem, and then you can go in and just sort of double check it and merge it.
So actually I had two questions, and the second one was if you think that a year from now or 2 years from now, when engineers would mainly do code reviews on automated PRs on problems. They will write a prompt in English and just do like 10 pull request reviews during the daily work.
Yeah, I definitely think that's where it's going. Actually, I think that's where it's going more on the client side as well, where I think that we're going to move away from using text editors to be like, okay, I want to solve this thing, so I got to write my migration, and I got to write my model and my controller that does it, my views that sort of whatever framework you're using. I think it'll be more like, I want to add this feature, and it'll generate. Like I said on stage, it'll generate 100 solutions and tests and everything, and then test all of them in parallel, and then show you 3 that are relatively, it seemed to be good options, and you can use those as starting points and be like, okay, this is the starting point, but change this part, right? And it's like, no problem, and it fires up 100 solutions based off of that to solve that problem, and it becomes sort of more of a conversation with language models and actually, I think frameworks and languages will start to evolve to be good at this, rather than, like, frameworks and languages right now I think are evolved to be good for what our weaknesses are as humans that have to work on one thing at a time and have to reason sort of logically about stuff, whereas I think we'll start seeing, the next, I don't know, Flask or Ruby on Rails or whatever sort of like, even languages, the next Rust or whatever, will be, here's features of the language that make it easy to test and to make sure to be generated 1,000 times and find good solutions out of it, right? And so I think we'll see those. I don't know exactly what they're going to look like, but I think we'll start seeing stuff that's like, this is written, this is designed to be used and generated by an LLM in a way that is manageable more easily than what we do now. So, but yeah, I definitely think, it just generates sort of it generates 15 files and says, I think this is the pull request you want. And then you can have, instead of commenting on the code, you can say, that's great, but change this. And then it gives you another commit that changes that, right? And you're like, okay, that looks good, let's merge that in.
All right, it's a whole new textbook to write in software.
It's a lot of, yeah.
I have another question. So
yeah.
I'll tell you a daily scenario that we have. I work at Wix.com and we have around 1,500 engineers. And management every now and then introduces like new tools for LMS, learning systems, or project management. Every time engineers say we don't need it, we have like GitHub issues, GitHub projects, GitHub labs. And there's like a struggle. And I think it's because, it's very developer oriented. And what they say actually is that the whole organization communication is inside Git anyhow, so let's use it. And management don't really like the interface, right? So right now we have people moving, GitHub issues into Monday or Asana, and so management could see the view that they like. So do you think that there's a place now for GitHub to release like a slick UX interface for like higher level management who don't want to see the GitHub interface?
Yeah, maybe. I think actually the more interesting thing for me is the opposite, where I think GitHub, for what I use it for day to day, we don't use those features. We use Linear actually to do a lot of our issue stuff. I think I think GitHub is great for, I don't care about those tools as much, but I need something, right? Like, and that's actually how we designed it. We designed it very minimally to be like, this is just like a very simple issue tracker so that you don't have to use something outside. But I think there should be tooling that's just concentrating on that problem, right? Of how do we describe problems, how do we describe workflow or roadmap or what we want to work on, or what the iterations look like, right? Or what the, however you want to manage your work. And then I think that you can also have a much better engineering channel, right? Like a chat that's just about talking about code, right? Or like chat that has sort of like a different channel for each branch that everybody's working on, right? Or like I think separating out, this is engineering work, this is work to actually talk about solutions to problems rather than the problems themselves, right? And that there's some sort of link between them. That's more powerful. GitHub kind of does a light version of all of those things kind of put together, but I think it's most companies get to a point where they'll graduate away from kind of a lot of the core features that GitHub has, and then the core thing that GitHub's really good at is review, right? Like is pull request review, talking about code, figuring out what the right solution is. But there can be much more powerful, I think, tooling around that. Like I would love to see chat that's not an engineering channel in Slack, right? That's the same tool set as every other channel in Slack, but something that's built specifically for the engineering problems, right? Or review, right? I mean, a lot of companies have different review systems. Like when they get really big, Facebook or Google or whatever, they have Garrett, they have Fabricator, they have these other toolings that are more patch-based, right, or stacked branches, or things like that, where you start having to get into more complicated workflows than really what pull requests provide. But 90% of people start and end there, and then you get more complicated and you branch out into more specific things. But I'm interested in what are really specific, like only engineers. Like we really kind of want to build GitButler so it's only stuff that's valuable for engineers and like not anybody else. How does an engineering team get work done?
By the way, I totally get you. I've been a manager for a few years, and I totally get this. I've been struggling with that as well, so yeah.
Maybe I'll add one more thing. I'm thinking about even simple stuff like you see documentation as a manager, and then you want to fix it. And if it's on Git, then you have to do like a pull request, commit. It's not very trivial for management, and I think there's some sort of market failure at this level when it crosses to management. So
yeah, it would be helpful for that interface to be more transparent. Yeah. All right, next question.
I remember when GitHub was being acquired, there was a lot of talk in the community about, oh no, our tool is being sold to the evil empire. At that time, were you hearing a lot of that noise? Did you have concerns yourself, obviously coming from the open source world? And what were your thoughts about knowing that Microsoft would be a good steward of your baby? Because obviously, as we've seen, GitHub has only grown into an even more useful and impactful tool.
Yeah, so it was interesting. At the time, we had good relationships with Microsoft, so I had really directly worked with them on the libgit 2 project because I wanted, one of the problems with Git is that it's not reentrant, right? So there's no linkable library that you can build sort of bindings in Ruby or Python or whatever onto, and so we started this project with Google Summer of Code students, and then we worked very, very closely with Microsoft, with senior Microsoft engineers, because they wanted the same thing for Team Foundation Server, I think. And so GitHub and Microsoft worked together for a long time with many engineers each, right? Like to work on how do we build a good, solid, reentrant library that we can all write Ruby bindings or Rust bindings or whatever to and use in our individual solutions. And so I got a lot of respect for Microsoft and for Microsoft's respect for open source during that time. And worked closely with a lot of Microsoft engineers where they were like, we kind of made fun of them, right? Like we had Git commit messages that had swear words in it or whatever, and they're like, we have to take this out, like it's Microsoft, right? And we were like, oh my God, but like, they're right. Like there's nothing, I think, I kind of came around that they're professional, right? And they do care very much. Like the whole ethos of the company. Like I grew up doing, you know, open source and Linux and stuff in the 90s, right? Like late 90s, where Microsoft was 100% the enemy. Like it was hard to get it out of my brain. But by the time that the acquisition was announced, I actually thought that it was the best possible landing place for GitHub, because there weren't it was either we IPO and then you have market pressure, right? And I feel like that can be much worse than being sort of a sub company where they care about the network, right? They care about open source. That's why they bought the company, right? Is that they wanted to be thought of better by the open source community. They wanted to embrace open source more, and they wanted to sort of acquire this community of people that are like, oh, maybe I should try out Azure, right? That's kind of what I think that they're, and I use GitHub, everybody uses GitHub Actions, pays for Azure, right? And so I would never use Azure otherwise, because it's so difficult. I've tried it before. It's very difficult, the APIs and stuff. But I use GitHub Actions a lot, so I use Azure. And so I think that was kind of their strategy, and they value that entry point into their Azure products, and they value it for the network and for the community, and not because it makes them a ton of money, right? Whereas if it had IPO'd, it would have been, we have to make money, we have to make shareholders happy. And so I actually, and then looking at the only other options for acquisition would have been Google or Amazon, probably. And for what Google and Amazon would have wanted GitHub for, I think Microsoft had a better vision for keeping the community in the network and valuing that very, very highly. And they brought in a guy that I've known for a really long time in the open source community, Nat Friedman, who, you know, did GNOME and stuff like back in the day that I started, right? And I was like, it's great that they got somebody who really gets open source and has done open source and understands Microsoft and can kind of, you know, bridge these worlds in a nice way. And so I was actually very, very excited about it. And I think that they've done a great job. I still think that all of the stuff that they ship, Copilot and Actions and all these stuff, like, it's been amazing. Like, I use that stuff all the time. Yeah.
Hi, so I'm more curious about GitButler. So how do you start and continue and manage a company as a tech person, not a person that likes to do managing people? So isn't
yeah, I mean, I think of myself as, I mean, I ran a company before this that was after GitHub, it was a language learning company, so it was very different, and I kind of learned how I CEO, right? And I'm not necessarily good at managing people. I don't want a lot of direct reports. I like being able to envision product, right, and help hire people and get people around me that are good at executing on, like, helping me with the product vision and executing that in the end. And so I've kind of learned how I like to work. And sometimes that's code. I know I'm not going to be able to do that forever, but right now it's a small enough team that it's valuable to be able to do that or do proof of concepts or something like that. But yeah, I mean, it's a discipline. I know what I'm good at and what I'm not good at, and what I should be trusting other people to do, and how to communicate that in a good way. And so I feel more comfortable now actually than I even did when I left GitHub, I think, because of the experience that I've had in the past. But yeah, it's very exciting to have a vision and be like, I kind of know what I want, and let's iterate on this, let's figure this out, let's test it out, and we're in this early stage that's real fun to build stuff and to use it yourself and to figure out, you know, is this where we want it to go, or like is it really solving the core problems that is our vision of what we want to solve, and super fun. Anything else? Yeah.
So with the rise of new language models like ChatGPT, do you think it's ethical for developers to take out code snippets, generated code snippets, and implement them in their projects, and then close source the projects and monetize them? What's your take on this?
I do. But I mean, you should be able to. I think, well, so I don't know how the models are trained exactly, but I personally, you know, it depends on the mindset that you come into open source with, because pretty much all open source is used that way, or at least that's why I think open source is powerful, is because you can use them in private projects. Like most almost every large, useful open source project is corporate sponsored in some way, right? So Git, Linux, it doesn't matter what it is, everything that you build, all of the stuff that you're working on, whether it's open source or whether it's closed source, there's a corporate sponsor, there's somebody at a company that's being paid to maintain that, right? Linus is paid by a company. GitHub hires, we had 4 or 5 people that were just paid to work on open source projects, right? And so, like, I think it's very difficult to pretend that there's like this real big divide between the open source and closed source worlds. Like if you write a library that's going to be incorporated, like libgit2 is a good example. Like we spent resources on it, Microsoft spent resources on it, but GitLab uses it, right? Like direct competitors to us use it, and we're fine with that because that's the nature of open source, right? Is that you just don't want everybody to be reinventing the wheel all the time. And so that's why you open source stuff. And I think most licenses, hopefully the way that they indexed it is look for licenses that encourage this, that say, because, I mean, what's the difference? I guess in my mind I don't see a huge difference between me open sourcing a project that I spent time and money and resources on and you guys going and looking at it and learning from it and taking snippets of it and using it, right? Or just even learning from it, right? Okay, this is how this is implemented, and then going and implementing it in a closed source project or in your own project or something. I'm fine with that's why I open source it, right? Is to share with the community. And if you find something, hopefully you contribute it back and you don't kind of hoard it, but I don't feel the need to like enforce that with a license, right? If you want to do that, do that. Like that's not why I'm sharing it. I'm sharing it to share it. Like I wrote the Pro Git book and I open sourced it so that everybody could read it. Like the point wasn't that to make money off of it. It was to help people learn, right? And if you come to open source with that mentality, then I think you take some, but those people probably also give back in some way, in some other library that you might use in the future or something like that. And so I like that ethos of open source, and I see it that way. Not everybody does, right? You can license your stuff AGPL or whatever, and be like, or even stupider licenses that really make it difficult to use your stuff. But I always grew up in the open source world of MIT, where it's just like, do whatever you want, right? Like use it, learn from it, incorporate it, hopefully contribute it to it. But like that's what I think open source is good for. I think it's moved the entire industry forward leaps and bounds because of that mentality, and not because of the sort of GPL mentality, right? Which I find really kind of destructive and difficult. And I think really the only people that really benefit from licenses like GPL and AGPL are lawyers. I don't think software developers really benefit from that. So that's my personal take. I mean, I know I used to be real copy. I had a hat that said copy left, right? Like when I was a teenager, like I was really into that world. But I think I've come to be like a little bit more laissez-faire about it. Like I like the idea of not caring as much and just doing it because you love it, and sharing because you want to give somebody else a step on the ladder, right? To help them learn or to help them not waste their time. That's mine. Yeah.
One last question, actually.
We can talk after.
Hi. So on the topic of the future of programming, you said yourself that, for example, we implement AI in programming, that we can ask a question for implementation and it will provide us 100 of implementations, and we can ask for 3 best of them. So I've heard opinions that, yeah, maybe with this we will become less software developers and more prompt engineers. So what would be your thoughts on this?
Yeah, I don't know
And a
about...
short answer, please.
Yeah, I think that what's going to happen is it'll be like any other tool you use, right? That helps you work a little bit faster. I think it's just another iteration of open source whereas before I'd have to figure out, okay, how do I write? I used to write how to manipulate Ruby or Git objects in Ruby. Now I started a new company where I need to do the same thing, and I use the libgit2 library, and I use Rust bindings to it that I didn't contribute to at all, right? And so it builds and it builds, and now I save all of that time I would have had to do re-implementing all of that stuff at a low level. I'm just standing on top of the shoulders of people who stood on top of my shoulders 10 years ago, right? And so, like, I think that that the AI things are going to be similar to that, where it's just, yes, like, it will do some coding for you, but you're still going to have to look at it. You're still going to have taste about it. Like, I don't know that you will ask questions, or you can go in and edit the code or whatever, but like, it's going to be about how do I get the job done, and you'll have tools to make that job easier, right? I don't see any massive difference between using a library, which is just taking a bunch of written code by somebody else and implementing things on top of it, versus having an AI generate a bunch of code for you, right? And then be like, yep, that looks good, and I'll add some custom stuff or whatever. But I don't think it'll be prompt engineering so much as I need to know what the solution I want is, and I have tools to help me do that faster. Okay, thank you very much. I think we have other people coming in. It's nice to meet everybody.
Thanks, Josh.